I'm here with Mr. Gautam Sood, a distinguished DEI and leadership development consultant, coach, and law professor at Pepperdine with a rich background in law and business and academic research. As a former criminal prosecutor, Gautam uniquely understands the culture of public agencies, and he's leveraged his experience and expertise to design impactful workshops for organizations like the California State Assembly and the Orange County District Attorney's Office and UCLA's Anderson School of Management. Gautam is also a national mock trial champion from his years at UCLA, and he helped guide me on route to my mock trial national championship, also from UCLA. I consider him a mentor and a friend. Gautam, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
So Gautam, you're a law professor now, you're a coach, but you're a former criminal prosecutor. Why not serve as a lawyer full-time anymore?
It's a really good question, and I think it's one that probably lawyers everywhere. My reasons are uniquely different, I think, than a lot of other folks. So I guess first and foremost, let me just offer that I am one of the most fortunate people in the world. I have an absolutely incredible partner, Amanda Bond, who also was a mock trial champion way back in the day. I think first and foremost, what it comes down to is I majored in political science as an undergrad with a minor in public policy. So the truth is I really wasn't qualified to do anything else aside from be a lawyer. So I ended up going to law school. Then as a criminal prosecutor, it was a wonderful job, right? I think I really learned the ins and outs of becoming a lawyer, learned the ins and outs of public agencies, learned what drives them, learned about the politics of sort of the organization. And I was there almost a decade and dealing with a whole host of really challenging stuff, right? And I think as a DA, you end up getting to see some of sort of the people under the worst circumstances making some really challenging decisions for themselves. And I think as somebody who comes from a background that may be underrepresented or maybe misunderstood, certainly at least in the time that I kind of was growing up, I found that there was not necessarily as much compassion, at least in that line of work. Certainly there were opportunities for compassion, but it was sort of, I had to be certain and confident about everything. And I think that that's particularly tough within the law because there is often a lot of uncertainty. There's often a lot of arguments in one direction or the other. And I think that some of the forces within the organization, which is sort of by design and sort of almost required by the nature of the job, is that you really can't have that uncertainty. You have to be sort of certain. And I think as somebody who wants to look at things through the lens of kind of compassion and understanding, there definitely was space for that, but probably not as much as I was hoping for when I sort of had taken the job. And you do have discretion. For me, I loved practicing law, and I think I loved having sort of the opportunity to kind of make a difference in folks' lives. I just didn't really enjoy having to answer to so many people all the time, constantly. And it was this relentless process of keeping everybody happy, whether it was the judge in front of us, whether it was opposing counsel, whether it was sort of all the support staff who help us do what we're going to do, whether it was police agencies. I think the idea of serving that many different folks to try and do the right thing just felt so exhausting. And I would often find myself just coming home and really just absolutely laying myself out and just wondering, like, why am I feeling so stressed? Why am I feeling so burned out? And I think just that process of going over and over again and trying 70 plus cases over the course of almost 9 years, it just really took its toll. I loved that as a prosecutor, I was able to help people. And that was really something I wanted to tap into. And I think as a lawyer, that is generally speaking what you do. But I think it's you're helping people sort of in almost one of the most challenging times in their lives. And I really wanted to be able to help people at a time when they weren't under the stress of having to be forced to make that decision. And so it was a little bit more about helping people collaborate and figure out what their goals were and then helping them get there. And so that's really, I think, what drove the pivot. And then also I had sort of my own personal desires of wanting to learn more about a lot of different things. And I think, especially when you're working in criminal law, there's a lot of, it's sort of like a mile deep, but like an inch wide, because you become an expert in this very specific space. And I think one of the things I learned about myself is that as interesting as that can be and as expert as you can become in that thing, I think I really loved having a breadth of information and a breadth of knowledge. And so for me, the pivot was really more about what are other things that I can learn about, because commuting from Los Angeles to Orange County ended up eating up probably about an hour and a half to 2 hours each way, depending on traffic that day. And so there was just a lot of lost time in that commute. And so I kind of wanted to reclaim some of that for myself and just have a little bit more, honestly, decision-making authority about what I wanted to do and how I was going to get there.
There's a lot of places that people would consider to be compassionate areas or disciplines. I'm not sure if the first thing people think about when they imagine compassion is an MBA program. So, what led you from not finding compassion in your pursuits as a lawyer to then turn towards business school?
And to tell you the truth, I'm not even sure that my decision to go to get to earn an MBA was driven by compassion. I think it was really more about increasing the areas that I would be exposed to. And I think that sort of led me down the path of organizational behavior, learning a lot more about that. And I think one of the most sort of life-changing experience, and I really do mean sincerely life-changing, was learning about the concept of implicit bias. One of the reasons why it was particularly life-changing is I had just completed a career of almost 9 years as a DA. And I remember learning about how implicit bias was sort of this thing that exists. And this was back in 2017, prior to sort of it reaching the mainstream and sort of the way it has. And I remember thinking to myself, implicit bias is actually impacting folks' decision making in a way that they may not even be cognizant of. And I remember thinking to myself, like, my gosh, like I spent 9 years making decisions that were impacting the outcomes of folks' lives. And I had no concept that this was even a thing that could be influencing it. And so I think what that really did is it forced me to reckon with myself, like, has this blind spot really, really adversely impacted a lot of my decision making? And so I think what that led me to understand is that kind of in some ways it sort of forced me to have compassion for myself, that really, I think not having any knowledge about it existing, you can't really be held responsible for. I mean, you certainly could, but I think I wanted to give myself a little bit of grace. And so I think once I discovered that concept and realizing how it could be very, very impactful, it's led me down this rabbit hole of understanding organizational development and sort of organizational leadership. And I think what I found is that in business in general, and the principles that were learned there really sort of extend to kind of the general broader public, it became really, really clear to me that I think organizations are doing their best, but often there is a lot of blind spots and folks really aren't able to see them, and because they're blind, obviously. And I think in a lot of ways, what that helped me understand is that we just need to give each other more grace.
Let's say that you find an organization that you think would benefit from an outside consultant such as yourself. As you indicated a little while ago, they might have a blind spot. They might not know that there even is a problem, the same way that you weren't clear on what implicit bias really meant until you went for that additional layer of training. It's one thing to say, you recognize that there's a problem, and so do I, and I can help you. It's another thing to say, I recognize there's a problem, you don't, but you need my help from the outside. As a consultant, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, right? I think it's really, really easy for somebody on the outside to be like, here's your problem, number 1 through 10, and you need to fix them this way. And I think to me, that's not really persuasive. That's not really compelling. And so often, I think the way I like to work with organizations is I want to try and find an opportunity to speak with as many different folks at as many different levels as they will provide access to. And so that starts at the top, that starts, with middle management, and that starts with kind of folks who are just beginning. So from my perspective, what I love to do is just literally collect data, basically learn what the pain points are across the board, and then be able to sort of show those pain points to the organization, saying, hey, here's what we're hearing from sort of this group of individuals. Here's what we're hearing from this group of individuals. And here's what we're hearing from this group of individuals. Here are the 3 to 5 common themes that I'm seeing that are unfolding. And then just asking folks, how does that resonate with you, right? Because it is sort of a collaborative process. But from my perspective, because I'm an outsider coming into an organization, I want to understand, what do the people within the organization see to be the challenge? And then there I can kind of apply my own learnings and my own teachings, help identify where we can kind of try and start minimizing the friction in those areas. So a lot of it, I think, is earning credibility by just being curious about what it is that folks have to say about the organization itself. I do my best to try and make it as anonymous as possible, especially because often folks may not want to be as honest if they know that they could be held on the hook for it. And so that's sort of one of the things that I really, really care deeply about is candor. And I always really want to try and create an environment that is conducive to that, so that I can sort of earn that credibility and say, hey, here's what I'm hearing. How does that sort of land with you? And then we form a strategy based on that. And we form kind of what the goals are. And then we devise a process to help reach them.
Let's say that you devise the process after you've spoken with the right people, they've given you the candor that you wanted, and people are on the same page about, we realize there's a problem, now we've got to do something about it. How do you make it stick?
That's a really good question. I think each organization is going to be a little bit different. I think one of the things that I was really, really fortunate to have been able to do was after I completed my MBA, I was able to serve as a postdoc at UCLA Anderson out of the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, where we were effectively applying behavioral science evidence to the development of workshops. So we were basically looking at research that was helping us see what is actually going to help move the needle. And so I was really, really fortunate to come into the teachings of sort of choice architecture, which is the idea of the manner in which sort of the environment under which folks are presented with the decision. We can often influence behavior depending on how those decision-making processes are presented to them or how that environment is presented or managed, basically. And so in terms of how to make it stick, I think it really comes down to me, the bottom line is that if you're creating those workshops, but you're providing sort of space to sort of honor that work.
When you look at the competitive landscape of consulting and coaching, there's probably a lot of signifiers that are known within the industry, but not to lay people about what makes one coach more or less credible than another. When you browse through competitors' websites, what are some things you notice that indicate these people know what they're talking about versus this thing seems like a red flag to me?
You're very, very apt to note that. One of the things that I think with the Instagramization of the world, I think a lot of people have sort of like hey, we've got the answer for you. We can figure this out. We can do it real quick. And I think that the folks who are looking for that quick fix, in my opinion, if they can argue to you that or try to persuade you by saying, hey, we'll fix it very quickly, in my opinion, those folks probably aren't really being honest, I think, with themselves. I think they're trying to make the sale, which I understand. Everybody is sort of in a different spot. But I would say folks who are promising the world without really showing or having the credentials to identify that this is how we're going to get there or what the process looks like, or having the training really in order to help you get there. That to me seems to be a really, really big red flag. I think I look to experience as well. I look to sort of what is their past experience? How did they get to this moment in time? What is the story about how they got to this particular location? I think if it's sort of a flavor of the month that I decided to become a coach because coaching is great and there are organizations that will pay a good lump sum. I think really understanding the story of what's driving folks to that particular avenue is really, really important. How they got there, why they got there. And I think if folks are just doing it to kind of make the quick buck, obviously, I think you're going to usually be able to detect that if you kind of spend a little bit of time with those individuals. But I think for the folks who really have a story of how they got to where they got to, and it seems to be authentic and people are kind of bringing their whole selves into that story, I think that's usually a really, really big indicator. And then again, sort of whether they've been certified, whether they've been trained, whether they have the experience of having worked with folks, whether they have sort of a professional experience that kind of helps drive part of that story too. I think you obviously want to find folks who have that ability and who have enough life experience that they're not just sort of shooting from the hip.
You mentioned certification a moment ago. What are certifications that you see as meaningful in this field?
I think that the ICF, I think, is the primary coaching body, I guess I would say, that kind of provides certification. Oh, well, actually, I should say that they provide credentialing. And so often what I would look for is folks who have gone through a coaching program that is actually certified through the organization. I think that's really, really important. And then credentialing, I think, is sort of a separate piece where there are different layers of coaching. But I would say having folks who have gone through a meaningful coaching program is really, really helpful because it sort of forces them to abide by certain specific ethical standards, which I think is really, really, really important.
Your communication style in our conversation right now, I think most people would describe it as fluent, thorough, comprehensive, accessible. When you communicated as a lawyer, would you say the same adjectives applied or no?
Well, first of all, I'll say thank you. I don't know if anybody has ever described me as those things, but I am very, very grateful for those descriptions. I would say I think I suffer from a really, really great deal of perfectionism and sort of imposter syndrome. And I think that tends to drive a lot of my communication styles, right? Where are people understanding what I'm saying? Is that the case? And so I really want to try and do my best to distill things to the simplest form. I would say that certainly in trial, that was a big part of it because you're dealing with 12 members of the community. Everyone has their own background. Everyone has their own experience. Everyone has their own lenses through which they're looking at everything. And so I think a big part of my process was just making sure that I'm saying information that is going to resonate with people and I'm presenting it in a bunch of different ways so that anybody who overhears it or anybody who is targeted to be persuaded by it is moved by it. And so I guess I would say that I think those same adjectives would probably apply. I would say that maybe now I've learned to embrace sort of the imperfections and sort of call them out when I see them presenting themselves. And the goal with that is to draw a little bit more in the authenticity. And so I found a lot of my trial practice tended to be about putting on this perfect performance. And I think now I've been able to move a little bit away from that and recognize, like, hey, look, I'm going to screw things up and I'm going to make hundreds of, if not thousands of mistakes over the course of my career. But I think being able to call them out and being able to recognize that, but I'm still, doing a pretty good job, right? I'm still handling about 85 to 90% of the things that are going on. I think that's a pretty good ratio. And so I think just being able to embrace the uncertainty and recognize that nobody's perfect and really just sort of normalizing the imperfection.
At the top, you are introduced as a distinguished DEI consultant and coach. Right now, DEI is a four-letter word in some circles. Very prominent DEI activists like Robin DiAngelo has come under fire. There was that humiliating moment in the Matt Walsh movie. And I wonder what you would say about DEI in a time where it seems like it's under attack with companies cutting funding for it. What would you say?
It's really, really tough because I think that at its core, what is DEI really? And I think if I were to sort of distill it, I think I would say DEI is really just having some level of understanding of the broader context. And I think the attack on DEI is to sort of keep in the shadows the reasons why things are happening the way they are. And it's sort of like a dedication to doing things the way they are currently being done and not really wanting to seek to improve. And to me, that's just flawed thinking, because my view is that if we're not evolving, if we're not innovating, if we're not changing, I think we're dying. And in a lot of ways, I think, DEI really isn't a favor. The way I view it, it's really a framework for how we can work well together across difference. Like, I think it's fair to say that the world is more diverse today than it ever has been. And I think it's just going to increase irrespective of kind of what the global attitude and discussion is. I think the reality is that people are just cross-pollinating all over the place. And so I think if we pretend that this problem is going to go away, it's not. And I think that there are multiple ways we can solve it. One is that everyone just sticks with what we're doing now and say, hey, we're just going to ride or die with this mindset. The other is let's be collaborative about it. Let's work together. Let's find ways that we can work together. One thing that I did as a postdoc at UCLA was running multiple workshops, which were around intergroup dialogue, which is basically building connections across difference. And I think what was really, really formative for me and what really, I think, helped me see what's happening, right? I ran workshops for, I would say at this point, thousands of folks during that time. And I think what was really, really clear is that you may have a white individual who is a Jehovah's Witness, and then you may have a Sikh individual who is a short Indian gentleman, right? And those two people seemingly would have virtually nothing in common. But what was really, really fascinating to me was seeing a situation where over the course of the intergroup dialogue, that both of them had worked to hide their past, to hide their religious background. One, the sort of Jehovah's Witness individual, basically didn't want to tell anybody what his practice was. The Sikh individual, despite having a turban, had actually chosen to cut his hair so that folks wouldn't ask him the question. And I think what that really showed me is that, yes, they're different in terms of sort of what the actual physical struggle is, but the reality is both of the folks are struggling in an attempt to fit in. To me, I think what DEI suggests is let's show up as we are and let's be okay and understand that everybody's a little bit different, but there's always something that everyone's voice can offer to the table. And kind of the example I always use is I think about an orchestra, right? Is that you've got some folks who are able to play the violin really well, some people who can play the cello really well, some people who can play the flute really well. And so rather than trying to say everybody now has to play the flute or everybody has to play the cello, why can't we make space for each person to shine, but then to work together to make beautiful music? And I think that that is really the way I think about it.
Let's imagine that someone says, I'm all on board with diversity in food, and I understand the importance of knowing other perspective. But what I'm really afraid of is somebody who is less qualified, getting a role that should go to someone else based on merit, which might be code for, look, I think that there is a white dude who could do this job very well, and I'm worried there's going to be a trade-off with someone who's not a white dude who I don't think might be as good as the job. What's the response?
It's a good question, right? And I think this is reminiscent of sort of the affirmative action kind of discussions that we had historically. And my general response to that is I think number one is that we have to appreciate sort of the historical context of how we got to where we got to. And I don't think it's about putting unqualified people in place. I think what it is it's about at least using a magnifying glass to sort of understand the broader context under which those accomplishments were met. One of my favorite studies that I remember reading related to resumes in particular, where you have folks of backgrounds where the name might identify what their social identity is. And folks with virtually equal resumes were with names that were sort of more culturally acceptable, with sort of like white names versus sort of black names, right? If we're just kind of calling it what it is. And what they found is that even when the credentials were exactly the same, the nature of the name being attached to that resume ended up really impacting outcomes. To me, I think it's really, really hard to look at that and then not see that, look, there is a problem where sort of there's this perception that if you are of a underrepresented background, you have to be orders of magnitude better, or even if you are just as good. The reality is that the social context under which all of this is sort of unfolded, we still aren't going to look at that person as being equal. And another really, really famous study that I really, really thought was very, very eye-opening was the orchestra study, where if you had blind orchestra studies where at some point there was a huge, huge imbalance with gender representation, where women were very, very minimally represented on orchestras, then they ultimately ended up putting up a screen during auditions where it was just based on the quality of the music as opposed to being able to identify who the person was by actually getting to see them. And what they found is that once you were actually just evaluating the quality of the work, that it eliminated sort of any discrepancy. Not entirely, but largely eliminated the majority of the discrepancies. And so what I say to those folks is that, look, you're putting somebody who is less qualified in that place. And I would say I think that is a talking point. I think really, if you look at it, I don't think organizations are in the business of putting people who are underqualified into a particular place. I think that organizations want the best folks for the job, but I think oftentimes we hold folks of underrepresented backgrounds to a much higher standard, where it's like, well, if you're not better than sort of the analog here, then we won't invite you and give you that opportunity. And there's so much research in recruiting that talks about how problematic it can be in terms of what the processes that are in place. And so in principle, I agree with the idea that you shouldn't put somebody unqualified. However, I would say somebody who has had a much more challenging upbringing, a much more challenging set of social contexts, and yet they're still able to accomplish all that they are able to accomplish in a way that is comparable to another candidate who has been provided with, or who has earned that same level of success with maybe fewer struggles. In my opinion, I don't think it's even a close call. I think the person who's had more to deal with and has accomplished those same really impressive things probably ought to get a second or a third look, or at least being able to have the context under which that was accomplished looked at more specifically and valued. And I think that that would be sort of my thought around that.
So it seems that your view isn't something that stops at culture or at race or at gender. It's about the life experiences and the struggles that people have accumulated. And certainly some backgrounds might make it more likely they could have encountered some of those struggles, but not necessarily. Am I representing that correctly?
I think that's fair. I think the way I always kind of think about it is, when I think about social identities, right, is that often there are many that are very, very obvious when you look at them. So, for example, I present as a brown individual. And so it's very, very clear that I am not sort of European descent. And I think one of the things that's really, really challenging with social identities in particular, which is often we tend to categorize folks very, very quickly. That's just sort of how the brain operates, right? If we think back to like Kahneman's system 1 and system 2 thinking, right, is that we make a lot of snap judgments because our brain is looking to kind of work efficiently. So the way I think about it is that there are often a lot of social identities, for example, that folks aren't able to detect. And so, for example, if somebody is neurodivergent, if you don't hear them speak, you don't necessarily have an awareness of that neurodivergence. And so there is a story that is available to be understood. And it's just whether or not we take the time to do so. For example, like I have 10% worse hearing out of one ear than the other. That's not apparent to other folks, but it is a part of my story. And there's a reason and explanation, and there are small coping mechanisms that I engage in. And so I think if we try and distill the human experience down to a finite group of like race, gender, and whatever sort of the visually perceivable aspects of social identity are, I think that's problematic, because I think we are a tapestry of a whole host of different things. Yes, social identities are lenses through which other folks will see us. And also there is life experience that ends up really sort of how folks approach the world. And to me, I think the most important thing is to be curious about those stories, to understand what those stories are, and to see what we can learn from them, because inevitably there is something to be learned from everybody. For example, nobody is going to know everything better than somebody else. Everybody knows at least something better than everybody else.
Speaking of individuals who might know something better than others, it's not only that you were a mock trial national champion and an experienced prosecutor, but you've also had a lot of experience seeing a whole lot of former mock trial contestants go on to become actual lawyers. Putting together your whole mock trial and real trial career for the fans in the audience, who would you say is either the most influential mocker you've ever seen or the most collectively influential mock trial team? For example, 2003 Iowa.
That's a very good question. Well, I'm going to be unbelievably remiss if I did not say that, in my very, very humble and unbiased opinion, the number one person I would say is Amanda Bond, who is my wife. And so I think I have to just put that out there. There's a defensible case there for sure. So, and I'm not just saying that, right? Multiple time All American, 2-time national champion, very, very impressive in all ways. I think there are many, many lessons to be learned from many, many different people. In terms of the most influential team, right? And I think that 2003 Iowa team was certainly influential to us. I think we learned an awful lot. And I would love to say that the national championship team that I participated on was the single most influential. I would like to say that I think we were at least helpful in terms of helping to raise the game at least a little bit in how we kind of think about things. I think you've certainly got a claim for yourself as well. I think that you've been unbelievably important to kind of the activity and kind of providing it with a much broader platform, which I think is unbelievably important. I would say certainly Amanda Bond is very important. I was extremely fortunate. I also got to compete with Brian Caforio as well, who is also a partner at Sussman Godfrey, where Amanda is. And he also was a multiple time national champion across the 3 national tournaments that he competed. I think he finished second, first, and first. So that's about as good of a resume as you can have. I would say those 2 folks, I was very, very fortunate to be on a team with both of them. And so I would say they were very, very capable. But I would say that 2003 Iowa team, we took a lot of lessons from them in terms of how to really capture the room, how to do things at your own pace, how to be impressive, how to be thoughtful, how to be methodical, how to not feel rushed within the moment. Those were really, really significant, I think, learnings that we took away. Of course, I would love to say that I'm one of the most influential, but of course would not in any way broadcast that publicly. But yeah, I would say from me and from our era, and actually I think one of the unsung heroes truly was my co-counsel as well, was Meeta Chakravarti, who I think doesn't get a lot of play on the national circuit. But, you know, the year that UCLA ended up winning their first national championship, she was an All-American on the other side as an opener and with a perfect 20-point. And then actually on the defense as the middle attorney between myself and Mr. Caforio, she earned 15 ranks out of 20 as a middle attorney. And she got 3 firsts and was unranked on the last. So you're talking about somebody who I think was competing with some of the best in history, not myself, but Mr. Caforio, of course, and was able to take 7 out of 8 firsts at the national tournament, playing against the second place team, the third place team, and I think another honorable mention team. And I think that is no small feat either. And so I'll give a shout out to her as well, because I think she was also unbelievably instrumental in helping create the framework at UCLA to help us earn however many national championships we have now.
We are 5, going on 6 next year, baby. Going on 6
let's
next
hope
year.
So. Let's hope so. Let's hope so.
Oh, and for the audience, if you want to watch that Iowa team in action, go to YouTube, AMTA 2003 National Championship Final Round. If you want to watch the Caforio, Chakravarti, Sood team, that is behind a paywall on the AMTA website. That's collegemocktrial.org. And I'm not saying you should pirate it because that would be against the law. And I'm talking to a former prosecutor.
That's good judgment. That's good judgment.
Okay. Well, Gautam, thank you so much for your time, your expertise, this very scintillating discussion. If people want to find you online, where can they find you?
You can find me and my business partner, Liza, at interlaceconsulting.com, and you'll find both of us there. We are available to sort of offer both coaching services and also consulting services. There's a variety of areas that we can kind of consult in. You can also find me in a classroom at Pepperdine University teaching contracts in the fall. And that's another place you can find me. But yeah, or just gautamsood@gmail.com. If you're looking for just to connect, that's also fine too. But Gautam at Interlace Consulting will also work too. And I'm hopeful you can just sort of host both of those for us.
Thank you so much, Gautam. And thank you to everybody here for listening. That's it for this episode of Authentalk.